Have you ever thought about something, something that seems pretty simple at first glance, but then the more you dig into it, you start to realize, wow, there's a lot more going on here than I initially thought.
Yeah, definitely. Like sometimes the things that we think we understand the best can actually be the most complex when we really start to unpack them, you know?
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're doing today, right? We're diving into one of those questions that can spark some pretty intense debate and maybe even some confusion along the way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, think about it, even just trying to define something as seemingly straightforward as a religious identity can get complicated really quickly, especially when you're dealing with, deeply held beliefs and centuries of history.
Right. And that's exactly what we're tackling in this deep dive, the whole question of, are Mormons Christian?
Yeah, that's a big one. And, the source material we're using for this is a really interesting article called Are Mormons Christian? It's actually a discussion between these two guys, Alex and Jacob Hansen.
Okay, so right off the bat, Jacob Hansen, who is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, makes it clear that Mormons absolutely consider themselves Christian.
Right, but I'm guessing that might not be the immediate assumption for everyone listening, especially if you're coming from a more traditional Christian background, right?
Exactly. So that's what we're going to explore. Why does this question even come up in the first place? What is it about Mormonism that sometimes puts it at odds with the broader understanding of Christianity?
One of the first things that the article highlights is that a lot of people's understanding of Mormonism isn't necessarily based on, firsthand experience or knowledge.
It's more like those things you hear through the grapevines, so to speak. Those sometimes funny, sometimes not so funny portrayals in pop culture.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you think about the musical, The Book of Mormon, that definitely plays up certain aspects of the faith for comedic effect.
And sometimes it's just these random claims you see online, right? I remember hearing this whole thing about Mormons believing that they'll each get their own planet in the afterlife.
Right, exactly. And the article uses that example too.
Yeah.
It's like this idea that's circulated so widely that has become almost a defining characteristic in some people's minds.
But is it really an accurate reflection of what Mormons actually believe?
Probably not entirely,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it speaks to this larger issue of relying on secondhand information to form our opinions about things,
Mm.
especially when it comes to something as complex and personal as religion.
And what's interesting is that Alex, the guy who's kind of the outside perspective in the article, he talks about how his own interest in Mormonism was actually sparked by some of these, really unique historical details.
Oh, yeah. What were some of the things that stood out to you when you read about Alex's initial encounter with Mormonism?
Well, okay, so first of all, the whole story of Joseph Smith translating the golden plates with his head in a hat. Come on, that's not your average religious origin story.
No, definitely not. It's pretty
Oh.
out there, right?
Yeah. And then you have this really intense period of persecution that Mormons faced historically, right? There was even an extermination order issued against them in Missouri.
Wow, I didn't know about that.
Yeah.
That's a pretty dark chapter.
Yeah, for real. And then the fact that Joseph Smith was the first U.S. presidential candidate to be assassinated, that's crazy.
It definitely highlights a history that's both distinct and really turbulent, right?
Absolutely. And I think what Alex's experience kind of shows is that Mormonism has this whole narrative, this whole set of foundational events that are pretty different from what you typically hear about in mainstream Christian history.
Right, and I think that difference can be both fascinating and, unfortunately, kind of a source of division for some people.
It's like that thing where the more something seems different or outside the norm, the easier it is to just label it as other.
Yeah, and I think that leads to this really interesting philosophical point that Alex brings up in the article. He says that if he had to pick a Christian denomination, he'd choose Mormonism.
Yeah, I caught that too, and it sounds kind of like a joke at first, but he's actually making a really thought-provoking point there, don't you think?
Totally. I think he's trying to challenge people's assumptions and make them examine the criteria they're using to judge Mormonism.
He's saying, if you're going to critique Mormonism, are you holding other Christian denominations to those same standards?
Right, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. Many different branches of Christianity have their own unique interpretations of Scripture and their own ways of practicing their faith.
So to say that Mormonism is somehow outside the bounds of Christianity, while accepting this huge diversity within Christianity itself, might actually reveal some inconsistencies in your own theological framework.
That's a good point. It really makes you think about where we draw the lines and what the core defining features of Christianity really are.
Exactly. And Jacob the Mormon in the discussion really emphasizes this idea of double standards in religious discourse. He points out that people are often quick to dismiss Mormonism without truly understanding its teachings or the lived experiences of its members.
And I think that's a problem we see a lot, right?
Yeah.
It's easier to just label something and dismiss it than to actually engage with it on a deeper level.
And the thing is, Mormonism is not exactly some tiny, obscure group. Jacob brings up some statistics that are pretty mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah. What were some of the numbers that stood out to you in that part of the discussion?
Well, first of all, the fact that it's one of the fastest growing Christian movements in the last 200 years, that's huge.
Yeah. That alone tells you something, right?
And then when he said that there are more Latter-day Saints in the world today than there are Jews, that really put things into perspective for me.
Yeah. I mean, that's a significant global presence, right?
Mm.
And then the fact that its early growth rate was estimated to be like 10 times faster than that of early Christianity, that's just wild.
And it's especially striking when you consider all the persecution that we were talking about earlier, right?
For sure. It makes you wonder what factors contributed to that kind of rapid expansion, even in the face of such adversity.
Right. And Alex actually brings up a good point about that, too. He mentions that early Puritans also faced extreme persecution, which makes their growth even more remarkable.
Yeah, but then Jacob counters that by reminding us that Mormons also endured some pretty horrific persecution, being driven from their homes, facing government-sanctioned violence and mob attacks. I mean, it's a powerful reminder that growth doesn't always come easy.
Absolutely. And then Jacob shifts the focus a bit by talking about some sociological studies that have been done on Mormons.
Oh, yeah, I remember that part. What did those studies say?
Well, apparently they often describe LDS members as being very pro-social, meaning they're known for being generous, being really involved in their communities, and being deeply committed to their faith.
That's interesting. It's almost like it's looking at the effects of their beliefs in action, right? Like, if those are the qualities that are consistently being observed in Mormon communities, it says something about the values that are being emphasized within their faith.
Exactly. And one of the practices that often comes up when talking about Mormonism is tithing, the idea of giving 10% of your income to the church.
Yeah, Jacob explains how tithing works within the LDS Church. He says that it's kind of a standard expectation for participating in temple rituals.
Right. So it's not like you have to pay to be a Mormon, but it's definitely a sign of commitment and involvement.
And it's not like tithing is some uniquely Mormon invention either, right? I mean, it's based on biblical principles, this idea of consecrating a portion of your resources to God.
Yeah, and I was actually kind of surprised, just like Alex was in the article, to learn that the word tithe literally means a tenth. It's right there in the etymology of the word.
That's kind of cool, right? It just shows you how this practice has these deep historical and religious roots.
But you know where things can get really tricky is when we start talking about the concept of salvation and how that's viewed differently in Mormonism versus more mainstream Christianity.
Yeah, this is where the theological differences become really apparent and where a lot of the tension arises.
The article talks about how many traditional Christians believe that Mormons aren't truly saved because they don't adhere to their specific interpretation of Christian doctrine.
Right, and some even go so far as to say that Mormons are heretics, or that they've been deceived by false teachings.
And that's where things can get pretty heavy, right? Because it's basically saying that Mormons are going to hell.
Yeah, it's definitely a serious claim,
Mm-hmm.
and it reflects a really fundamental disagreement about the nature of God, the role of Jesus, and the path to salvation.
And Jacob actually challenges that pretty directly. He asks, if Christianity itself is so diverse with all these different denominations with their own unique beliefs and practices, then where do you draw the line? What are the absolute non-negotiables that determine whether someone is in or out?
It's a really good question, and it forces you to think critically about what it truly means to be Christian.
And Alex brings up another interesting concept, too. He mentions universalism, which is the belief that ultimately everyone will be saved regardless of their religious beliefs.
So is that like saying everyone goes to heaven no matter what?
Right. Essentially. Yeah, and Jacob clarifies that universalism isn't really a mainstream belief within Mormonism. They tend to see their faith as a restoration of Christ's original teachings and believe that those teachings offer a specific path towards salvation.
So it's not like they believe everyone is automatically saved, but they also don't necessarily subscribe to this idea of eternal damnation for those who don't follow their specific faith.
Right. It's more nuanced than that. I think what this whole deep dive has really shown us is that the question of are Mormons Christian doesn't have a simple yes or no answer.
It's much more complicated than that, right? There's all this historical baggage, theological debate, and social context to consider.
Exactly. We've seen how misunderstandings can easily arise from relying on secondhand information, how Mormon identity has been shaped by some really pivotal historical events, and how those key theological differences, especially when it comes to salvation, can create some pretty significant divides.
And yet, despite all of that, we've also acknowledged the incredible growth of the LDS Church and the fact that sociological studies often depict Mormons as being really positive contributors to society.
Which I think leads to a really important question for all of us listening. What does this tell us about how we define religious identity in today's world?
Right. If a group like the LDS Church can experience such rapid growth and make such significant social contributions while still being viewed with suspicion or even hostility by some segments of Christianity, what does that say about our capacity for interfaith understanding?
It really challenges us to move beyond those surface-level judgments and engage with different faith traditions in a more meaningful way.
I think that's the key takeaway here, right? We need to be willing to listen, to learn, and to try to understand the beliefs and practices of others, even if they differ from our own.
Because ultimately, it's about recognizing our shared humanity and finding ways to build bridges of understanding and respect, even amidst those disagreements.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
And until next time, keep thinking, keep exploring, and keep those questions coming.
We'll see you again soon.
See ya.